That's something you could do digital only. Now,
But
if you want
Balaji,
to do
before we
okay,
go too
yeah,
far, I'd actually like to kind of just back up and just like emphasize this one point before we start talking more concretely
please.
about like the future tribes, the future network states. That the just to really drive the point home as to like if anyone is skeptical as like, oh, how is this Discord channel or how is my Telegram group going to turn into a physical country somewhere? And there are some parts of the crypto world that we're already seeing accept some of these outcomes or trajectories. There's this like meme in the crypto space that, you know, everything will have a token, right? Is it a protocol? It's going to have a token. Is it a protocol? It's going to have a DAO. There are some people who are also going as so far to say every single DeFi app, every single DeFi protocol will also have its own chain, will also have its own like layer 2 or layer 3 or app chain on Cosmos. And all of a sudden, not only do you have your own native currency, but you actually have your own like economy. And that economy, if it's its own chain, starts to actually collect, you know, transaction fees, like taxes, if you will. And so like first we have this shared value, shared community that's coalescing around this token because everything's going to have a token. Then we can lean into that and be like, well, everything is actually going to be able to produce its own boundaries on its own, like layer 3 on top of ZK Sync or app chain on top of Cosmos, and then create its own literal protocol based off of the community that's around this currency. And so like these things seem to have like a set of believers who kind of think this outcome is a little bit inevitable for every single community that's out there. And so like now we're getting into examples of you know, the uncancel community, uncancel, like the anti-cancel culture community. And what you were about to show on the screen is like the sugar-free keto culture community. Like
Yes.
as soon as we figure out how to have tokens for each one of these things, it's not that many steps removed from some of the infrastructure that we are already talking about here on the show.
So yeah, so one thing though I do want to stress is I'm very big on this concept of the one commandment in the book, which is a non-monetary thing, right? That's to say, I am very much about like, look, I'm pro-capitalist, obviously I'm pro-crypto, I'm pro-tokens, pro all that stuff, but I'm about them as a tool rather than a goal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is a lot of discords, because they start money first. And what happens? Lots of people are there for the free money when airdrop, right? Like, you know, that is it good that folks, you know, have some way to live? And so, sure, I'm not against people making money. The problem is when that comes first, everybody's there. They're not really united by anything, right? What you want to do is start with the kind of moral foundations first. Now, the moment I start talking about morality, people will basically be like, "Oh, that's weird," or you know, "What are you, preacher?" Blah blah. Let me see if I can motivate that. In Western society, you have folks who, when you say morality, they are very reticent. They will say, "Who am I to judge? I'm a fallible person. I can't really tell others how to live, etc." That's one reflex. The other reflex is when you get them on politics. This is how everybody should live. We ought to pass a law at gunpoint if necessary. Screw them, tax them, blah blah blah. And so they go from 0 to infinity, like this. Like it's totally bipolar, right? Oh, I'm so, you know, I can't judge at all, to I judge everything and I will enforce it now, right? And in between that 0 and infinity, how about a 1? Right. So that's what I call like a one commandment. I'm not saying to come up with your own religion and 10 commandments. And that's actually a really big deal to do. It's like a whole software infrastructure in its own way. It's a social order. But you could come up with one commandment. Okay. One way that you feel society is at large failing, that you are morally innovating on, that you think you have a better way of life, that people should live like this, that it's the single biggest problem, whether it's, you can think of it as obesity or as screen time or it's cancellation or it's guns or it's alcohol or
Balaji,
it's
ours is
right.
banks.
Yours is
Bankless.
banks. There you go. Right. Okay, perfect. Okay, bankless. There you go. So once you have that one commandment, and it really should be reduced to like the smallest number of words, and almost in a guttural way I remove is. So rather than even saying banks are bad, I'd be like banks bad, right? Why say it like that? Because you're going to say it a zillion times, and it will need to sort of be laced into the community. And the ideal one commandment is one which has a real polarization against default society, but that only changes that one thing and then the implications of it. So when you say banks bad, You're not changing traffic lights. You're not changing, I don't know, like the laws on how electrical power is wired or something like that. You're not trying to change that stuff, right? You're not trying to change how words are pronounced or change the language to Turkish, right? All those other things are remaining constants. You are changing this one dimension. Bank's bad. That's actually a pretty big dimension, by the way, to change. Okay. And easier, you may require legal kinds of things for that, and so on and so forth. But it's totally, it's in line with what you guys are doing. So you've got energy and so on behind it. You have a historical critique, right? And by the way, how much do you guys know about like what happened under like Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank and what have you? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I mean,
Loosely,
it
yeah.
increased the complexity. So I want to dig into that. But by the way, while you were talking, I tweeted out from the Bankless account, Bank's bad. That tweet is doing quite well at this moment and is on message.
Are
We
you?
have
Is it at Bankless HQ?
yeah, Bankless HQ.
All right, I'm gonna
Well,
RT that.
yeah, so am I. People are gonna wondering what we're up to.
I mean, this is the meme layer. This is kind of the moral philosophy of what we're doing. This very much fits the Bankless Twitter. But continue. Yeah,
Yep.
tell us. So why is Sarbanes-Oxley applicable here? Banking regulation.
Yeah, I'm just gonna. I have one commandment. All right. I'm just gonna link this. It's too good to not just link.
We got
So,
20 already in the first minute.
Yep. All
Doing a little
right.
social engineering here with Balaji on
This is
Bankless.
This is super meta. When people hear the pod, they'll be like,
Oh, I remember that tweet.
"Yep,
I remember liking that tweet.
here you go." I just replied so you can. I could also QT it, but I thought that was fine. All right.
Nice.
Anyway, so where are we? I just
Do you
lost
want to
my
get
train
back
of
to
thought.
Sarbanes?
Yeah. Okay, so here I wanted to show you this. Your critique of everything will be just vastly more sophisticated and remember the thing we were talking about at the beginning with like knowing the laws of physics, like all of that accumulated thing, like summarizing it here, like it just makes your argument more powerful. You have a stronger base. Like you ever do squats? You know, you go to the, like you
yeah.
you lift, right?
I
do
do.
you even lift, bro? Like okay, like
I lifted.
all right. So
Lifted.
lifted at least sometimes. Point is, you need like a strong base, like good positioning to like lift a lot of weight, right? And banks, big thing, right? So I think you get a lot of leverage out of essentially writing the history of banks from a critical perspective, right? From a crypto critical perspective. Let me give you an example. Take a look at the thing I just pasted into chat. Okay. The state's solution to the financial crisis was to stop in 2008 was to stop issuing commercial bank charters for almost a decade. It was a coronation disguised as regulation. Okay, so click that first image. Look at that. Basically, they said banks bad, but how did they deal with it? They've rewarded them by essentially eliminating their competition completely.
So what we are looking at is a graph of the number of new FDIC insured commercial bank charters in the United States from 2000 to 2019. And right at 2008, 2009, the number of new FDIC insured commercial banks, it's like it was 188 in 2000, it was 167 in 2005, it was 175 in 2007, basically drops to zero. Because like there was like a social distaste for banks, right? But what Balaji, the point you're making is that, okay, we have this distaste for banks, therefore we're just eliminating all future banks, making all current banks the new winners, the new incumbents.
Exactly, that's right. And then, but fortunately, we'd had the internet, and so we routed around that in two ways. So if you look at the next graph, fintech was a front end during this period, even though you couldn't get a new bank charter. With fintech, people could build all these very amazing layers on top of this antiquated banking system, right? That's Stripe, that's Square, that's Mercury. There's all these guys, built things over the 2010s, Stripe and Square especially, right? And Coinbase and so on, right? But I'd say Stripe and Square are like classic, fintech unicorns, right? They're working on top of this antiquated, bank backend. And the reason it's so antiquated, imagine if like when you sent an email, okay, behind the scenes, it got printed out and delivered via Pony Express to the other side of the country, and it took 2 to 3 days to get there, and then it got scanned on the other side. And that is a pretty good analogy for fintech on top of the wire transfer system, like the legacy wire transfer system. It's like this Pony Express thing under the hood. And if you put unusual workloads on top of it, like, Robinhood experience with, the GameStop trading, if you put unusual loads on top of it, it will not make it, right? Okay, so fintech became the front end, and you go to the next one, and blockchain became the back end, right? So basically, they stopped new bank charters from getting issued. But like in a pincer attack, fintech built the front end, blockchain built the back end, and like neobanks are now arising that have the UX of a fintech and the back end of a crypto protocol, and that's like totally packet based and outside the system, right? So anyway,
I'm a big fan of this trajectory so far. I love this.
Yes. So the point is, if you go back just that's a history that just goes back 20 years. If you write the history of banks, I think you will find way more interesting nuggets there that deepen your critique of the system and also show why they were set up in that way in the first place, such that your proposed reforms. That's why you really want to go after banks. You have to become a counter historian. You need to understand why the rules were set up the way they were. You need to understand their legitimating history better than the bankers and the regulators do themselves in order to quote it back to them chapter and verse, and to point out all the things they missed so that your V3 fixes not just the abuses of the American regulatory state, but the abuses they claim to prevent as well.
And by the way, I don't think that's that difficult, because I feel like a lot of regulators and bankers have forgotten the first principles of why they were formed in the first place and what they're seeking to protect. This is the first commandment, right? So like for the bankless nation, the bankless community, it's not about all of the money you can earn in crypto. It's not wealth first. It's mission first.
Yes.
It's tribe first. It's nation first. That's what you see as the one commandment, and is essential for the formation of a network state.
That's exactly right. And the thing is that, you sort of know this as an investor, by the way. You know that, you back missionaries over mercenaries, right? That missionaries who believe in the purpose, they don't quit, right? Mercenaries are just there for a paycheck. You see that with armies,
Right.
like nationalism of the French variety was actually, that was a left-wing ideology for a long time, before it's now associated with the right. But nationalism gave essentially everybody like an equity stake in the country, at least mentally. And so those nationalist armies felt they were fighting for something that they themselves belonged to as a citizen, and they often beat, the hired guns of a monarch, right? So one has to understand why monarchies were defeated by nationalism. Missionaries beat mercenaries almost always, right? Like nationalists beat usually soldiers of monarchs because they're more motivated. And so starting with that moral premise and attracting people on the base of that moral premise without any money, that's actually kind of what a startup is, by the way, right? A startup is, there's a potential, there's an equity stake, right? But fundamentally, people are there early on because they believe in the mission. If you're doing a startup and you're recruiting people on the basis of a paycheck, of a higher paycheck or comparable paycheck to a Google or whatever, you're just not going to make it. NGMI, right? So it's a mistake to start money first as a motivator. Money should be removed as a constraint. Money can be, you do have to make the dollars and cents add up, absolutely, but it's a tool to achieve that purpose. So the one thing I would also do is I'd say, yeah, banks bad is really important, but you also need to say X is good. I mean, Ethereum is good. I'm sure you'd say that, right? Then you'd have derivations and things of that. Like, once you agree, for example, that banks are bad, you might say self-sovereignty or self-custody is good. And you have all these derivations from that. And so that set of moral premises, the more you can get of those and get those explicit, I think it'll just make you really strong as a community, because you can now start doing tracking polls, for example, right? You know how you have uptime graphs? You ever seen those?
Yeah.
Right. So you do a tracking poll for your community and you ask, are banks bad? Yes, no. Is self-sovereignty, self-custody good? Whatever. You ask these questions, And you will actually see numerically what percentage of your community agrees with you on these things over time. Now, why would anybody ever disagree? Well, I mean, let's say there's some huge hack or whatever, then maybe people's confidence in self-sovereignty declines. And then you have to bolster it again, or you have to flip on that perhaps. But a flip is a really big thing. It kind of means that, your moral fiber is, eroded. You've lost the peg in an important sense, right? I'll show a provocative pair of graphs. Okay. Obviously, the Terra USD thing when it lost the peg, right?
Yeah. Good times.
Good times. I'm not involved in any of this stuff, but here, let me show you this curve, and then I'm going to show something else. So just take this image, right? You see it was flat, and then it just suddenly falls off a cliff. The thing that people were relying on a constant became a variable, right? That happened over a series of hours, but there's something that's kind of similar, and that is like the decline of religion in America. You used to kind of be able to take for granted that people had this base of believing in Christianity or what have you. And you look at some of these graphs, like church membership among US adults now below 50%. And this graph looks like this graph.
Just
right?
like the wobble before the complete collapse.
Yes. And it's down like it was flat at like 77% for decades. And then, dropped. And then now it's like down to like 47%. It's dropped like, more points in a few years than it had in like decades before then. Right.
Balaji, America kind of feels like it's been wobbling more and more and more ever since 2008.
Yeah, but it's been accelerating, arguably. But yes, you can argue when it's
No, I'm saying it's definitely accelerating. Like the 2008 was the first wobble, and then we got back to stability for a while. But now, ever since 2016, it's been wobbly.
Yeah, though the thing is that one thing that's useful is to take the long lens on certain things, and some of these trends started probably before you were born, like the Fed funds rate, right? I'm not sure if you've seen this. So this is like the interest rate, right? And the thing about this is, you see, so this is like the 1980s, and you see how this is just been declining with spikes back up, but decline, right? And then here's like the zero lower bound interest rate. And what is the long-term trend there? It is absolutely like a trend towards lower and lower and lower interest rates, right? They just keep stimulating the economy, and they try to let it recover, and go back to normal, but it needs to be stimulated again and stimulated again. And like they juiced it to such an extent over here, and they hiked rates. They're probably going to be forced to print again. Okay, just looking at that long-term trend. And they'll print longer and harder than what happened in the 2010s. And that may result in like serious inflation. The point is, these wobbles began even before 2016. There's certain things that are in the system that like have gone back further, right? Other things like Social Security and stuff go back even further than that. So, I'm not saying all these things are inevitable, but I'm saying that some of them, go back further. Point is, when you have something that was a constant that becomes variable, right? When it goes from USD, of Terra as 1.0 to something much, much less than that very fast, or it goes even over decades, like everybody's a Christian, or you can basically assume 77% of Americans Christians are like less than 50%. The entire premise of society now changes. You have structures that were set up on a certain set of assumptions that, people just no longer agree. A small example, an important example, abolish the police. Okay. Like that's something where you might have had 99% support for that the police should exist, or 99.9, whatever, in the 90s, in the 2000s. That was not a political issue. Suddenly, for a time, that dropped to like maybe double digits said the police should not exist. All right. That's a huge shift in society. Those people they have a fundamentally different conception of what society should be. You can argue whether that is a good or bad moral innovation. I think probably you're going to need some kind of police force of some kind. But it is certainly just those folks cannot really live in the same jurisdiction. They have a different view on what like fundamental premises are. So that's why it's actually important to measure these kinds of things in a tracking poll and make sure your community has that strong moral fiber, which is the premises for all of your arguments as a content creator, right? If you enumerate all your moral premises, those are like the notes that you're using to generate your song.